In other videos, we've seen how you can use the imperfective aspect to talk about two things happening at the same time. Я читаю «Войну и мир» и пью кофе. And there's another way to express this kind of thought, and it looks like this. Читая «Войну и мир», я пью кофе. This form, читая, is an adverb that's derived from a verb, so let's call it a verbal adverb, деепричастие. In other words, it describes another action, or some would say, it gives an additional or secondary sense, добавочное, второстепенное значение, to the action in the main clause. There are two kinds of verbal adverbs, imperfective and perfective. In this video, we'll just cover the imperfective verbal adverbs. These often have to do with time, expressing simultaneous actions. Let's look at some examples. Читая книги, она пила кофе. Читая книги, я пью кофе. Читая книги, мы будем пить кофе. These imperfective verbal adverbs don't express any particular time in terms of the past or present or future. They just express that the action is happening at the same time as the other action in the main clause. And did you notice one other really nice thing about these? Like other adverbs, the imperfective verbal adverb does not change for case, gender, number, or anything. Sometimes they have the nuance of one thing causing another thing, or making it possible. Зная площадь, можно подсчитать вес всей атмосферы Земли. So, how do we form them? It's pretty easy. Just start with the они form, drop the ending, and add я. Читая. That's it. From держать, we have они держат, drop the ending, держа. Here we want to remember the 8-letter spelling rule. After these 8 letters, we write a instead of ya. And even though we get the stem from the они form, the stress of the verbal adverb will normally be the same as the stress of the я form. So we have держа with stress on the last syllable, just like я держу. And what about verbs with a reflexive ending? Well, we can treat these the same as other verbs, replacing the third person ending with я, and then we'll add the reflexive ending. We'll use s мягкий знак here, as we normally do after a vowel sound, to get улыбаясь. You might recall that verbs ending in давать, ставать, and знавать have this quirk. The va drops out in the present tense, but it does stay in the verbal adverb. So we have давая, вставая, and узнавая, with the я replacing the т мягкий знак of the infinitive. And there is one important exception. The verbal adverb for быть is будучи. Будучи президентом, он ездил на старой машине, жил в маленьком доме. And you may also see идучи from идти and едучи from ехать, though these are probably considered to be archaic these days, or poetic. I should mention that not all verbs can form these verbal adverbs. Писать is one common example, and if an infinitive ends in нуть or ch, or if the present stem is just a couple of consonants, like пьют or ждут, then there won't be an imperfective verbal adverb. For some words, Russian does have a way around these seeming gaps. We don't form an imperfective verbal adverb directly from хотеть, because the form хотя has taken on the meaning of although. But we can just use a verbal adverb from желать, to wish. Не желая обидеть родителей, я ничего не сказал. Similarly, even though ждать doesn't form an imperfective verbal adverb, we can use ожидать for the sense of waiting or expecting. Не ожидая никакого ответа от меня, он уехал. So, all in all, it's best to just listen for which verbs are commonly used in this form. One good example is говорить, which comes up in some really useful expressions as a verbal adverb. Честно говоря, я с вами согласен. Концерт, мягко говоря, необычный.
Короче говоря, я прихожу домой.
That last clip is from the romantic comedy Ironia судьбы, and if you want to find out who she found when she came home, be sure to watch the whole film. It's a classic. And here's one last cautionary note, especially for English speakers. This form is sometimes called a gerund, but I think it's best to be careful with that term because a gerund in some languages, including English, can be a noun that's derived from a verb. For example, I like reading. But even though Russian verbal adverbs like chitaya, думаю, do also translate into English with an ing ending, they cannot be used as nouns. Ideas like these are expressed differently in Russian. It's a healthy reminder that word-for-word translation usually doesn't work very well. Just keep in mind that imperfective verbal adverbs, like chitaya, are used with another verb, most often to express two simultaneous actions. Читая учебник по русской грамматике, я всегда засыпаю. Summing up, there are two types of verbal adverbs, imperfective and perfective. Imperfective verbal adverbs are formed by removing the ending of the present tense они form and adding я or я s мягкий знак for reflexive verbs. They add a secondary action to the verb in the main clause, typically expressing two simultaneous actions. Though they're often translated to English with phrases like while doing, take care not to confuse them with other uses of the ing suffix in English.